Inside the outbuilding, darkness deepened quickly. Several windows were broken, letting in the frigid air. There was no electricity. After registration and basic instructions, the women tried to settle onto narrow bunks or the straw-covered floor. Many wore only lightweight coats and worn-out boots. Some had no gloves at all. It soon became clear that the available blankets would not be enough. Only a few coarse military coverings were at hand, most already taken by male prisoners housed in adjacent rooms. The women's group received only what remained, just a handful of blankets and a thin layer of straw. Cold was not merely discomfort, it was a threat. In unheated shelters at sub-zero temperatures, the risk of frostbite and respiratory illness increased sharply. Their bodies, weakened by hunger and stress, reacted intensely. Even a single night without proper cover could lead to severe consequences. The women understood this not in theory but through lived experience. They had survived months of winter in ruined apartments, basements of bombed buildings, and barracks where fires burned out faster than rooms warmed. They knew how quickly a hunched back could become chronic pain, how fingers stiffened until they barely moved, how teeth chattered uncontrollably. In these conditions, an instinctive, collective response formed not from leadership or instruction, but from necessity. With so few blankets, they could not be used individually. Sharing was the only viable solution. By gathering close together, dividing the limited coverings, and combining their body heat, they could reduce the bitter cold's impact. It was not a gesture of solidarity in a moral sense, it was survival. Thus emerged the scene that would later deeply affect the Allied soldiers who discovered them before dawn. But before that moment, the women spent hours trying to organize even the smallest comfort. They rearranged straw, pushed it toward the walls to block drafts, created makeshift sleeping areas. Those with scarves or head coverings shared them with women who had nothing to protect their faces. Outside, the wind strengthened. Tree branches cracked in the distance, and the distant thump of artillery echoed from the front. Although the immediate area was relatively calm, the war had not ended. And for these women, everything was shifting from military roles to prisoner status, from ruined towns to improvised shelters, from familiar routines to the raw struggle for warmth. By nightfall, the temperature fell even lower. Boards in the walls cracked, allowing gusts of cold air to enter. It became clear that clothing alone would not sustain them. The few available blankets became lifelines. Around them, in complete darkness, took shape the image that would later be described in Allied reports as one of the most haunting episodes of the winter. Women huddled together, pressed tightly into shared blankets, fighting not an enemy, but the cold itself. The night settled over the abandoned outbuilding heavily, as though the cold itself had weight. Wind pressed against the cracked walls, squeezing through every gap in the wooden planks. The structure creaked quietly, its old frame struggling against the winter air. Inside, the temperature continued to fall, and the women quickly realized that the few thin blankets provided were not enough to protect any one person alone. What happened next did not emerge from instruction or planning, but from instinct sharpened by months of exposure and deprivation. As the cold intensified, the women moved closer to one another, tentative at first, then with growing urgency. They arranged themselves in tight clusters, sometimes 3 or 4 to a group, sometimes more when space allowed. The few blankets they had were stretched to cover as many bodies as possible, though the fabric barely reached. The thin layer of straw on the floor provided almost no insulation. Its dryness helped prevent direct contact with the freezing ground, but the chill still seeped through. Those who sat or lay on the outer edges felt the cold most sharply. They rotated positions when the numbness became unbearable, quietly shifting so each person spent some time shielded in the middle. Throughout the night, their breathing filled the darkness shallow, uneven, sometimes accompanied by the involuntary shiver that ran through their shoulders and backs. The air grew heavy with the smell of damp wool, cold fabric, and human exhaustion. Under the shared blankets, the women huddled close, not from comfort, but from the primal need to survive the freezing hours ahead. Some tried to tuck their hands beneath their coats or under each other's arms, protecting their fingers from frost. Others wrapped their feet in scraps of cloth, tightening knots with trembling hands. Every gesture was deliberate, shaped by experience on the retreating front where warmth had long since become a luxury. Outside, the wind struck the outbuilding in sudden bursts, rattling the boards and making the broken window panes tremble. Snow drifted against the walls, gathering in uneven piles. Occasionally, a distant engine could be heard, an Allied truck moving supplies somewhere along the road. The world beyond the shelter was active, moving, changing. Inside, the women's world had narrowed to a single goal: endure the night. Their bodies produced little heat. Weeks of inadequate food had stripped them of the reserves needed to withstand cold. Faces were pale, even in the dim light, and fingers turned almost white as circulation slowed. A few women pressed their foreheads against the coarse blankets, as if hiding within the fabric itself. The cold was relentless, and even the slightest shift in position let in another pocket of freezing air. Hours passed. Darkness deepened. The building held no source of warmth besides the bodies of the women themselves. The slow, rhythmic rise and fall of shared breathing created a fragile sense of cohesion. It was not camaraderie. They barely spoke, barely moved. It was, instead, a silent, instinctive union, bonded by necessity. In the absence of blankets, some used their coats as outer coverings. A few had scarves that helped close gaps between clusters of bodies. The women positioned themselves carefully, pressing shoulder to shoulder, back to back, legs overlapping awkwardly to keep feet from freezing. Those on the outside curled inward, sometimes resting their heads against the shoulders of strangers simply to conserve heat. Occasionally, one of them would straighten slightly, trying to ease a cramp or find a better angle against the cold floor. These movements caused ripples through the group as the blanket lifted or shifted. The moment a draft slipped beneath the fabric, everyone felt it, and they instinctively tightened together again, closing ranks until the cold pocket disappeared. The night grew harsher. The temperature fell further. Breath turned to mist so quickly it almost seemed to crystallize in the air. For women already weakened by hunger, the cold became a new kind of burden, draining strength in a slow and steady rhythm. Some trembled uncontrollably. Others stopped shivering entirely as fatigue overwhelmed their muscles. At times, the wind outside paused, and a brief, eerie stillness filled the outbuilding. In those moments, the women could hear faint sounds from other buildings in the distance, muffled movement from male prisoners, occasional footsteps of Allied guards patrolling the perimeter. The quiet rustle of branches scraping against the walls. These sounds emphasized the isolation of their situation. Despite being surrounded by soldiers and other captives, the women were alone with their cold and exhaustion. Near the middle of the night, the temperature dropped sharply once more. The blanket groups tightened again. A few women leaned forward, pressing closer to others in a way that blurred the boundaries of personal space, no longer a concern in the face of freezing air. Shared body heat became the only barrier against the cold that seeped through the building like a slow tide. Some closed their eyes, not sleeping, but escaping for moments at a time into stillness. Others stared into the darkness, watching faint outlines of beams overhead or the pale light seeping through cracks in the wood. Even the strongest among them felt the creeping numbness in their limbs. The sounds of breathing continued steady, then uneven, then steady again, marking the long stretch of hours that had not yet ended. Their fight was not dramatic. It was quiet, slow, and constant, shaped by the smallest movements and the faintest warmth of another person pressed beside them. Only when the first hint of dawn touched the edges of the sky, still unseen but sensed through the gradual change in the air, did the night finally begin to loosen its grip. And with it came the moment that would soon shock the Allied soldiers entering the outbuilding for their morning rounds. the sight of German women prisoners gathered tightly beneath a single blanket, clinging to warmth in a scene that revealed more than words ever could about the human cost of winter and war. Dawn approached reluctantly that morning, pushing its way through the heavy winter clouds with a faint gray light. The cold remained unbroken. Frost clung to the edges of the outbuilding's broken windows, forming delicate patterns across the glass shards still lodged in the frame. The wind had quieted slightly, but the air inside the structure remained stagnant and icy, preserving the stillness that had dominated the night. Outside, Allied soldiers were already beginning their routine rounds. They walked along the perimeter, checking the integrity of makeshift enclosures and ensuring that none of the prisoners had attempted to break curfew. Snow crunched under their boots as they moved between buildings that had been hastily repurposed into temporary shelters. The night had been particularly harsh, and several guards exchanged brief glances, acknowledging the exhaustion they felt after hours spent in the cold. The sun had not yet risen fully when the soldiers reached the outbuilding that held the women. They paused briefly outside, adjusting their coats and rubbing their hands for warmth. The building looked even more fragile in the dim light, a weathered structure strained by wind and time, with boards that shuddered slightly whenever a gust swept across the field. When the soldiers opened the door, the cold inside seemed to spill outward like a wave. It struck sharply, a dense, unmoving air that carried the unmistakable stillness of long hours without heat. The interior remained dark except for a thin line of gray light filtering through cracks and broken window panes. At first, the soldiers' eyes struggled to adjust. The outlines of bodies became visible slowly. Clusters of women huddled on the floor, sharing the scarce blankets in tightly arranged formations. Some were seated upright, leaning into one another for support. Others lay curled on the straw-covered ground, limbs entwined in awkward angles, dictated not by comfort but by necessity. The blankets, those same few pieces of coarse military fabric, were stretched thinly across groups of 3 or 4 women at a time. In some clusters, a single blanket covered 5 or more. Many women had wrapped the edges around their shoulders or legs, but the cloth had slipped during the night, revealing pale hands, raw from cold, and faces marked by exhaustion. The sight was striking in its stillness. There was no chatter, no movement beyond the faint rise and fall of breathing. The women were stiff from cold and lack of sleep. Their hair was disheveled, their coats rumpled and dusted with frost. The air smelled of damp wool and the stale chill of a room that had held too many people without heat. Some of the soldiers hesitated at the doorway. They had seen devastation in many forms, destroyed towns, burned vehicles, abandoned trenches, but the quiet suffering inside the outbuilding struck a different note. It was not the violence of battle, not the chaos of retreat, but the aftermath of long, relentless deprivation. As the daylight grew stronger, the details became clearer. Many of the women's faces were gaunt, marked by the sharp lines that hunger creates. Their eyes were half open, glazed from fatigue. Their feet, wrapped hastily in cloth, showed signs of swelling from the cold. A few women stirred upon hearing the door open, but their movements were slow, hesitant, as though even turning their heads required effort. The soldiers stepped inside cautiously, mindful not to disturb anyone abruptly. Their boots brushed against straw, crunching softly. Some moved between the clusters, checking to ensure all the women were conscious. Most responded with slight movements, shifting, blinking, lifting a hand a few centimeters before letting it fall again. The thin blankets had clearly been shared out of necessity. None of the women had enough covering to keep warm alone, and the way they were positioned made clear that survival had been a collective effort. In the center of each group, the smallest amount of warmth had been preserved. Those at the edges looked the coldest. Their shoulders shuddered with delayed tremors as their bodies attempted to warm themselves. One soldier knelt beside a group near the wall, where the wind had penetrated most directly. The women there looked particularly frail. Their hands were tightly clasped to their chests or tucked under the arms of the women beside them. Frost had formed along the edges of their coats. Even their eyelashes held small grains of ice from the moisture of their breath freezing in the night air. Another soldier scanned the building, noting the lack of proper bedding, heat, or protective clothing. He observed how the straw had been pushed into mounds to block drafts from the walls, how scarves had been tied between gaps in an attempt to cover them, how the women had layered whatever scraps of fabric they possessed. The scene reflected not chaos, but a desperate, organized attempt to endure. For several long seconds, the soldiers remained quiet, absorbing the gravity of what they were seeing. There was no misunderstanding the situation. These women had not simply endured a cold night, they had faced conditions that could have easily turned fatal. The shared blankets were not just improvised bedding, they were the only barrier between the women and the life-threatening cold. Slowly, the soldiers began coordinating. Some left the building immediately to report the conditions and request additional blankets, heaters, and warm food. Others stayed behind, monitoring the women and encouraging them to remain as still as possible while waiting for help. Though the women were prisoners, they were also human beings who had survived the night through sheer will and cooperation. As the soldiers stepped carefully among them, the women gradually began to shift small, hesitant movements, marking the beginning of a painfully slow return from the numbness of the night. Shoulders lifted slightly under blankets, hands stirred, breath deepened. The cold still clung to the building, but the presence of the soldiers brought something else into the room, a sign that the night was finally ending. The discovery that morning would remain etched in the soldiers' memories, an image of survival, fragility, and the stark reality of winter in wartime. A scene where the war's effects were not measured in battles or maps, but in the way a group of women had clung to each other under a single blanket, fighting a quiet, invisible enemy, the cold. The morning after the discovery began with quick coordination. The soldiers who had seen the women at dawn reported the conditions immediately, stressing how they had survived the freezing night with almost no protection. Soon, additional personnel arrived with blankets, coats, straw, and hot broth. Inside, the cold was still severe. The women remained grouped where they had spent the night, their bodies stiff from hours of immobility. Movements were minimal, small attempts to sit or adjust their limbs. Their faces showed deep fatigue, pale skin, and the numbness that follows prolonged exposure. Blankets were handed out first. Soldiers wrapped them around the women, helping those who could barely lift their arms. Many clutched the fabric as warmth slowly returned. Others simply let the blankets fall into place, lacking strength to hold them. Then came the heated broth. The steam rising from metal cups brought immediate relief. The women's hands shook as they held the cups, but the warmth traveled slowly through their fingers and into their bodies. They drank in small, careful sips, allowing circulation to return gradually. More straw was spread across the floor, adding insulation. Soldiers repositioned the weakest women, supporting their shoulders and legs. The outbuilding remained cold, but it no longer felt life-threatening. Breathing grew steadier, shivering less constant, and faces began losing their rigid, frozen expressions. Outside, snow continued falling. More blankets and clothing arrived, and medics identified which women required evacuation to a heated infirmary. The others were encouraged to rest under the new coverings, conserving energy as their bodies adjusted. By midday, the difference was visible. The clusters loosened, as the women no longer needed to cling tightly for warmth. Some leaned against the walls, wrapped fully in blankets. Others lay back on the straw, eyes closed, overwhelmed by exhaustion rather than cold. Their hands regained slight color, and their breathing became calmer. Throughout the afternoon, soldiers monitored their condition, distributed remaining supplies, and prepared those with frostbite for transport. The atmosphere inside the outbuilding shifted from silent suffering to fragile recovery. Gradually, the place transformed. The cold was still present, but the immediate danger had passed. Blankets lay across shoulders, cups rested near straw beds, and the women's posture, though weak, was no longer rigid with fear. The soldiers would remember the scene not because of drama, but because of its quiet impact, women who had survived the winter freeze by sharing one blanket, relying entirely on each other when nothing else remained. A stark reminder that winter could be as deadly as war itself, and that survival sometimes depended on the simplest human act, staying close until morning arrived.